Welcome, everybody, to our Getting to the Music of Ernest Bloch, where we've had and are having a wonderful array of speakers telling us how it is to be part of the music of Bloch. So tonight, or this morning, depending on where you are, we have Dr. Alexander Knapp. Now, Alex is the reason that we have the International Ernest Bloch Society. It's at his instigation, his wish, his dream, that we have created the International Ernest Bloch Society and connected all the Bloch family and all the Bloch enthusiasts from across the world into one society, and we're working together to promote and to understand and to love the music of Ernest Bloch. Now, Alex, not only is he the instigator, but he is Dr. Bloch, I think you could say. He has been across the world lecturing in the music of Bloch. He has, with Norman Solomon here, edited the book from the conference which Alex and Norman created in Cambridge in 2007. We had an international festival in 2009, which was the 50th anniversary of Bloch's death. And he's been to China, and some of his lectures have been translated into Chinese and published there. And he's given his lectures at the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing. So who better could we possibly have to talk to us tonight than Alex? And I turn it over to you. Please unmute, and then you'll be ready to take the floor.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming along. It's lovely to see you, many good friends and everybody. And I'm really grateful for your company today. I have a PowerPoint presentation. We'll come to it in a moment. I think we'll keep it like this just for the moment, and then when the time comes to share the screen, then I'll mention it to you. I've got some audio examples. Unfortunately, the audio examples are a bit erratic. This was put together a little while ago, and I think for some reason there's some slippage. So I may have to crave your indulgence and ask for your patience in case we have one or two minor problems about the order of the examples, but I trust basically it will work out fine. Any rate, once again, many thanks for being here. Thank you to Geraldine for that extraordinary build-up, which I feel I'm going to be hard put to match up to, but I shall do my best. And here we have a presentation entitled The Appearance of Chinese Elements in Three Works by Ernest Bloch. So, to begin. It is mid-December 1993. We are in one of the lecture halls in the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing. The occasion is the last of my 6 lectures on multiple aspects of Jewish religious, folk, and art musics, given to an audience of musicologists and ethnomusicologists, composers and interpreters, students and visitors. I'm speaking about the Jewish influences upon the music of the Swiss-American composer Ernest Bloch, but as a special tribute to my hosts, I decide to add one further musical example from a long play record, nothing whatever to do with Jewish music. It is the finale of Bloch's 4 episodes for chamber orchestra, entitled, appropriately enough, Chinese. I read out the words of Edward Cole from the record sleeve. This is one of the, I quote, "This is one of the most delightful revels in Western pentatonic Orientalism imaginable." The implication being that there is really nothing specifically or authentically Chinese about it at all. But as the music unfolds, I observe that members of the audience are smiling and chatting to each other. So I turned to my interpreter. "What are they talking about?" I ask. I'm struck by her reply. "Well, they recognize this tune as being typical of one of the folk idioms of northern China, and that one as coming from the south of the country, and yet another as being in the old traditional style of kun, qu, Chinese opera." Now I'm really intrigued. I absolutely have to explore this whole dimension of Bloch's music further. So, on my return to London, I enter into conversation with certain Chinese music experts. And I also discover, on perusing my research resources extensively, that whereas other manifestations of Bloch's love for ethnic materials, primarily Jewish, Swiss, and indigenous American, have been well documented, nothing substantial can be found concerning his deep musical, philosophical, and spiritual affinities with the East and Southeast Asia in general, and with China in particular. So begins a journey that continues to the present day, and indeed beyond. For so far from claiming to offer a final statement on the subject, this talk attempts rather to represent work in progress. On reading certain primary sources and reproductions of primary sources, I learned that Bloch had done his homework. He had purchased sets of 78 RPM discs in New York between 1918 and 1920 as a newly arrived immigrant from Europe, and in San Francisco during the latter half of the 1920s, while director of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. Furthermore, he frequently visited Chinatown in San Francisco, and, as we shall shortly hear in his own words, the traditional live opera performances he attended made a profound and abiding effect upon him. I should add that according to certain scholars, the Chinese in Chinatown, whether in New York or San Francisco or elsewhere, would have been conservative in their tastes. Therefore, the influence of American society and culture, music and dance would have been minimal. Bloch had been attracted to music and culture from far beyond the West ever since childhood. His 10-year friendship with the eminent French critic Robert Godet between 1903 and 1913 served to enhance and deepen his interest in East and Southeast Asia. As a lecturer at the Geneva Conservatoire from 1911 till 1915, he introduced his students to the musics of Asia and Africa. But it was effectively in January 1917, at the age of 36, that he had his first direct and substantial contact with Chinese music, when he attended a theatre in New York to see a piece entitled The Yellow Jacket. He wrote as follows to his wife, Marguerite, who was still living in Geneva at the time. I quote, "It was so beautiful, so moving, so poetic. No real scenery at all through the imagination." End quote. He returned to Switzerland briefly in 1917 to gather his family and emigrate with them to the USA. And in the summer of the following year, Bloch rented a summer house which had a phonograph. Now he was able to play the 78 RPM records of Irish, Spanish, Hungarian, Serbian, Greek, Turkish, Syrian, Jewish, and Chinese musics that he had bought on the Lower East Side of New York. Bloch's elder daughter Suzanne asserts that these discs were not ethnic studies for the public, but records for the Chinese themselves, and quote, "and as authentic as could be," she says. Bloch at once enthused his entire family with a passion for this music. Even into his old age he would sing the Chinese tunes he absorbed from these early recordings. From 1919 till 1920, Bloch taught at the Walden School, a progressive educational institution for young children aged from 4 to 10, located in New England and run by Margaret Naumburg, Mrs. Waldo Frank. Here, Bloch taught programs of Chinese music appreciation, among other non-Western genres, and compiled a handbook, a written notebook, summarizing the children's impressions of the recordings they heard. And it was in 1919 that Bloch completed the first of the three main works incorporating Far Eastern musical materials that are under discussion in this talk. At this point, I'll describe the methodology according to which my commentary is structured. First of all, I'll discuss the two distinct sets of recordings of traditional Chinese pieces that Bloch collected at different times during his life, copies of which have been obtained from Bloch's younger daughter, Lucienne Bloch-Dimitrov, and generously made available to me by Lucienne's daughter, Sita Milchev, whom I'm delighted to say is here with us this afternoon, morning, evening, whatever time frame you're in. So welcome to Sita. We'll then hear one short extract from each collection in order to establish the kinds of Chinese idiom with which Bloch would have become familiar. Then I'll present, in chronological order of composition, the three Chinese works by Bloch. First of all, the finale of the Suite for Viola and Piano, 1919. Then the Chinese finale of the four episodes for chamber orchestra of 1926. And thirdly, the three movements Symphonic Suite for orchestra entitled Evocations, or Evocations, completed 11 years later in 1937. I should add that Oriental, so to speak, elements do appear in a few other works, for example, Nirvana for piano, 1923, Nuit Exotique for violin and piano, 1924, and Tonga Taboo from Paysage, Landscapes for string quartet, 1925. But these ones do not exhibit a specifically Far Eastern ethos. In each case, a quotation from Bloch's own writings will be followed by a short audio excerpt from the work in question. We'll then proceed to observations made by selected experts on Chinese music, who are, first of all, Kevin Hui and his wife Anne Kung, resident in London, to whom I'll refer from now on as Hui and Kung, whom I interviewed in March 1994 and who taught me about the five main Chinese modes, Gong, Shang, Jiao, Qu, and Yu. Now you have to forgive me for my Chinese pronunciation. I'm doing my best here, trying to incorporate the tones, the four special tones in Mandarin. And if there are any Chinese speakers here, I hope they will forgive me if I make any mistakes. So those are the first two experts. The second group were members of the Central Conservatory of Music, Ethnomusicology Department in Beijing, henceforth referred to as the Conservatory Scholars, whom I met in November 1994. And thirdly, Dr. Sun Zhuo, Cheng zither player and graduate of the SOAS, University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, assisted by her mother, the celebrated Cheng artist, Madame Qu Yun, whom I consulted much later, in September 2007. I'll close with general conclusions, including preliminary comparisons that I've made between traditional materials and Bloch's works, this to be followed by a final statement by Bloch concerning his feelings about Chinese music and culture, and some questions arising. Let's start then with Bloch's collections of recordings of Chinese music. The first of the two collections dates from 1918 to 1920. This includes 6 78 RPM discs of Chinese music recorded much later onto 2 cassette tapes by Lucienne Bloch-Dimitrov. The present location of the original discs appears to be unknown, unless I am corrected on that. Suzanne Bloch has referred to the fact that Bloch had written annotations on the record sleeves. It'd be wonderful to see what he had written on them. The 11 items are all in Hakka, which is one of the main dialects of Chinese, or Cantonese. According to Sun Zhuo, they include Peking opera pieces. By the way, Peking opera is the correct term, despite negative colonial resonances. Also, musical dramas, early 20th century popular songs such as Honey Bill and Jasmine Flower, obviously in their Chinese titles, instrumental pieces performed on round-shaped lute, brass gongs, lute, reed instruments, high-pitched fiddle, drum, etc. An extract from a drama from Southeast Asia will represent this collection. According to Lucien Bloch-Dimitrov, notes, Bloch played it a lot. So now I'm going to share my screen, and I hope this works. Now wait a minute. This may not be the correct one. Sorry, I'll start again. Now let's try this again.
Okay, shall I talk you through it?
That's not the right one. I'm sorry, I'll have to do it one more time.
Okay, so go to, first open your PowerPoint.
Well, the PowerPoint is open.
Good, so then go to share.
Yeah, done it.
Choose the PowerPoint. Click that screen of the PowerPoint.
I think it's that one.
And click share sound.
Share, yeah. Oh, that's wrong again. I don't know why this... Sorry, everybody. We'll get there. We'll get there. So now...
Close the screen that says post the Zoom screen on your computer. Not the one you're on, but the one that says post attendee.
Post what? Sorry?
Well, close all the other things on your computer that are not...
Do you remember this?
Sorry. Did I remember what?
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Let's carry on.
Okay, so the first example should be an extract from a drama in Southeast Asia, which represents the collection that Bloch gathered together between 1918 and 1920. It's a little bit crackly. It's a very old recording, obviously, well over 100 years old, and let's see if it works. No.
It obviously loves screen 3 and wants you to hear that very badly, but Alex wants you to hear screen 1, so we will persevere to do that.
Let's see if this works. Yeah. The second of the two collections was copyrighted by the Parlophone Company in London in 1934, and it may have become part of Bloch's library in the later 1930s. Music of the Orient was compiled, that's the title, Music of the Orient was compiled by the veteran ethnomusicologist Dr. Erich Moritz von Hornbostel, Professor of Ethnology and Comparative Music at the University of Berlin. It contains 25 items from Japan, China, Java, Bali, what was then known as Siam, Lower India, Persia, Egypt, and Tunis. China is represented by one piece of classical drama and two pieces of modern drama. In the accompanying booklet, one page of commentary is devoted to each piece. Photographs are shown on 2 of the 3 pages. So my next illustration, this is what you can see now on the screen, where it says China at the top, and then number 5, classical drama, Kunqu. So this shows Hornbostel's commentary on Chinese music in general, and in particular on the piece of classical drama. The history of lute playing was composed in about 1530 by Wei Liangfu, the founder of Kunqu, which is Chinese opera. We shall now hear, all being well, the opening phrases of this piece. So I hope this will work.
Well, no, yeah.
No. There, oh dear. It just slips, and I don't know why. But anyway.
It really wants us to hear slide 3, but we'll persevere to listen to slide 2.
Because eventually it gets there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's a bit quiet to begin with, but then it gets louder. So having now experienced the soundscape to which Bloch was exposed, we immediately shift our investigation to his 3 Chinese works, the Viola Suite, 4 episodes, and Evocations. We begin with the Viola Suite of 1919. Each of the 4 movements originally carried descriptive titles, and the last movement, to which we're about to pay special attention, was entitled The Land of the Sun. But Bloch felt dissatisfied with these designations and later abandoned them in favour of simple tempo and mood markings. Of the finale, Molto Vivo, Bloch wrote, I quote, "It is a vision of the Far East that inspired me. Java, Sumatra, Borneo, these wonderful countries I so often dreamed of, though I was never fortunate enough to visit them in any other way than through my imagination." Incidentally, it appears that in the summer of 1930, Bloch had the opportunity to travel to Bali via Japan and China and return to the USA via Tahiti. But events in his tumultuous personal life caused him to go to Europe instead. Let's hear the opening of the finale of the Viola Suite. I hope this should work. sorry about the abrupt endings. This is obviously a version of it that Bloch composed originally for viola and piano, but he then later composed a version for viola and orchestra, which is the visual that you see before you. Hui and Kung commented that 78 RPM recordings of Peking opera were becoming available in New York at about the time Bloch was working on his Viola Suite. They felt that although they could not identify any specific quotations, the modality was a combination of the Shang, Yu, and Jiao modes, and the melody was likely to have been inspired by the atmosphere of Chinatown in New York. Sun Zhuo noted the general Chinese flavour of the melody and harmony, whereas the conservatory scholars pointed to the general style of Taiwanese opera, and more specifically to a folk song entitled Ge Zai Xi from Fujian. The arrangement reminded them of the conservatory style favoured by some Chinese composers who adopt Western techniques of harmony, etc. The second work is entitled Chinese, the finale of the 4 episodes, written 7 years later in 1926. The names of the first 3 movements are Humoresque, Macabre, Obsession, and Pastoral. The original score requires an ensemble of 11 instruments comprising the standard string quintet, wind quintet, and piano. Interestingly, in Bloch's personal score, an additional trumpet, woodblock, gong, and multiple strings were added for a performance in 1930, involving a total of 30 instruments. Bloch's earlier working titles for this movement included At the Chinese Theatre, Impressions of the Chinese Theatre, and Chinatown. Bloch wrote a vivid description of the genesis and structure of this work, which reveals a deep underlying affection and respect for the genre he was attempting to evoke. And I quote, "Impressions of the Chinese Theatre in San Francisco. I went there every evening for a whole week from 7 p.m. to midnight, fascinated by its music, its colours, its odours, its mysteries, its little fragile and chaste princesses, its wild warriors with their dreadful beards, their terrifying dragons, all this fantastic imagination. I shuddered at times like a child in a dream, and feel still its irresistible nostalgia. I tried to reconstitute a synthesis where all these elements are mingled. Squeaking strings, raucous trumpets, diverse tam-tams, percussion instruments of wood, of metal, without forgetting the incredible voices of the actors. All this without any authentic Chinese instruments, not even their percussion. I have, though, used authentic themes noted from memory and created others of my own, saturated by this atmosphere. First, there is a prelude, somewhat as an accompaniment to a scenic and dramatic action. Weird rhythms, battery, then squeaking violins, and the theme of the first movement, Humoresque Macabre, seems to crawl underneath like a Chinese dragon. And the battery frames this episode. The violins start again, and over their background the singers, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, and cello, make heard a Chinese melody of my own, and this in fantastic and tragic accents that burst forth imitating the shrill, menacing trumpet oboe effect so well described by Paul Claudel in his Connaissance de l'Est. This is broken up by reminiscences of the dragon theme and the obsession theme that seems to become Chinese in its turn, and all this leads to a paroxysm ending with a violent salvo of the battery. Then comes another episode, fast and gay this time, on authentic Chinese motifs that go accelerating in stretto, but always clear and in joy. The tragic trumpet theme interrupts again, but like a conclusion, punctuated by the final note of the singers and percussion." End of quotation. While cataloguing the Suzanne Bloch archive in New York before its incorporation into the enormous Library of Congress Bloch collection in 2004, I was sadly unable to find the anthology of authentic Chinese melodies notated by Bloch from memory that is understood to have formed part of it. Here's the opening of the second section of Chinese. Let's have a look first of all, wait a moment. So I'll just take that out. Can you see at the top? This is the title page of the last movement of 4 episodes called Chinese. This is the first section. And this is the second section. Hui and Kung analysed the melodic material modally, whereas Sun Zhuo focused upon the ornamentation in the string writing, notably its similarity to the Jiahua acciaccatura technique. The conservatory scholars sensed that Bloch had achieved a fine understanding of the Peking opera style, especially in terms of phrasing, and likened the first theme to a melody entitled Xi Pi, used for many texts. However, they were critical of the pitches selected by Bloch, describing them as neither exact, nor correct, nor properly emphasized. The second theme was dubbed scenery music, which should ideally be in free rhythm, but which Bloch had somewhat artificially fixed. Now to the last of the 3 works, Evocations. This symphonic work was finished in 1937 at a time when war clouds were gathering in Europe. However, the earliest sketches, conceived as a 2-movement work for cello and piano, date from 1930, when Bloch was still domiciled in San Francisco. Having moved to Europe, he became preoccupied with other large-scale works and abandoned the sketches temporarily. But in the spring of 1936, he rediscovered a booklet of Esquisses Orientales, Oriental Sketches, and decided to enlarge the dimensions of the work to a full 17-minute long orchestral suite. A suitable title for the work as a whole, as well as for the individual movements, eluded him for a long time, despite his rereading of the literary text that had originally inspired the sketches, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the thoughts of Buddha, the writings of Confucius, Lao Tzu, Lin Yu Tang, and quotations from La Civilisation Chinoise by Marcel Granet. Bloch writes, I quote, "I became conscious once more that these 3 pieces were not at all descriptive or imitative or attempts to picture Oriental subjects, but were merely my personal reactions to certain Oriental stimuli. The pieces were much less descriptive than the Chinese theatre of the episodes, in which I used, beside motifs of my own, authentic Chinese melodies. Thus they were merely interpretations, and I was about to use that title when a friend of mine suggested Evocations, which seemed preferable to me." End quote. The titles of the individual movements that he finally settled upon were Contemplation, Huang Di, God of War, and Renouveau, Springtime or Renewal. As Alfred Frankenstein has written, quote, "They contrast the quietude of a Buddhistic meditation with the violent fury in which speaks, and with tragic timeliness, a Chinese god of war, while the suite ends in poetic freshness of spring and reawakening as cast in a Chinese mould." So first of all, the first of the movements, Contemplation. Bloch had originally considered Upanishads as the title for this movement, since the musical inspiration seems to relate more to Hindu philosophy than to Chinese. A later choice was Tai Ping, the Great Peace. the composer finally settled on contemplation. According to the conservatory scholars, the opening of this movement resembles a classical gu gu chang, which is zither, melody, yet they feel that the overall style is closer to that of westernized Chinese composers who tend to eschew Chinese elements in their works. We'll come back to an example of the opening of this movement at the end if there's time. The second movement, Huang Ti, God of War. Here in the original sketches for this movement, the idea of war was already prominent, but not crystallized. Music drew no response from the three groups of commentators, maybe because they felt there wasn't anything very much Chinese about them. Again, we'll come back to that presently if there's time. However, Renouveau, the finale, created several resonances for everybody, some specific, others more general. The initial theme, which we're about to hear, was for Bloch simply a reminiscence or nostalgia of San Francisco's Chinatown. For Hui and Kung, this melody could be compared with a song and dance tune known in Taiwan and Fujian as picking tea leaves, catching butterflies. The notation is shown in the next example. So here we have, in a Chinese book, the notation for this song, Picking Leaves, Catching the Butterflies, Cai Jia Pu Tie. Connections were also made with the celebrated violin concerto by Liang Zhu and with works by composers He Zanhao and Chen Gang. The conservatory scholars felt that the style was of a generation of Chinese composers who flourished in the 1950s. In other words, quite a lot later than the time that Bloch was composing this work. Being evocative of liberation, in quotation marks, the music would have been popular among the Malay public, and the solo flute featured at the outset would have brought to mind Chinese opera, and this was in the opinion of the conservatory scholars. So let's hear now the opening of Renouveau, the finale of Evocations. I hope it's loud enough. You may find that here using headphones might make it a little bit better, but anyway, we'll play it as it is now. Regarding Evocations as a whole, Sun Zhuo saw it as typical of the conservatory style in terms of scale, flow, and flavour. The conservatory scholars did not identify specific tunes, but thought that the work could compare with the mature works of any indigenous Chinese composer. Hui and Kung pointed to a possible Mongolian or northern Chinese orientation in certain passages. So now we come to conclusions. In my eagerness to identify parallels between traditional Chinese melos and Bloch's Chinese compositions, I notated several pentatonic themes from both collections of material. As yet, the direct quotations alluded to by Bloch in his writings have eluded me, but this analytical research may yet yield rich discoveries. Bloch connected with China not only through the media of recordings and theatrical performances in the Chinatowns of American cities. An example of his direct contact with prominent Chinese personalities took place on the 6th of May 1930, when he was invited by Henry Brandenstein, a prominent Californian lawyer, to a formal lunch in San Francisco given in honor of Mei Lanfang, one of the most celebrated exponents of Chinese opera in his day. As I gradually draw to a conclusion, here's a poignant and heartfelt statement by Bloch, originally contained within the Suzanne Bloch Archive in New York, and now held in the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. It is entitled, "About Jewish Music," and it's quite a long quotation, but I think it really is very revealing. Quote, "In my ignorance of the technique of the Chinese music and of the Chinese language, the only thing I can say about it is my own impression and the great pleasure I take in hearing it. This pleasure is not at all the reaction of a mind tired by our own Occidental music, or the attraction of novelty or strangeness. It is something more, something higher. I have heard records of Chinese music for years. At the beginning, perhaps, I was struck by the factor of novelty. At the same time, my impressions were somewhat confused. But the more I heard them, the more I enjoyed them. They became absolutely clear in their lines, in their form, melody, rhythm. Everything seems logical in them, like a law of nature. The performances by Chinese musicians in San Francisco gave me, of course, still greater joy. It is more than joy, it is a kind of fascination. Even through my imperfect receptivity, due to my ignorance, this music from another race, another world, has for me a style, a perfection that very few works of our Occidental art possess to such a degree. It is the true expression of an old civilization, of a refined culture beside which many of our Occidental manifestations seem barbaric. Nothing is brutal in it. It has force and delicacy at the same time. It always evokes life. It is an experience of life, not an arbitrary rhetoric. It seems to reflect a whole philosophy, an acceptance of destiny, without rebellion, without romanticism, a philosophy of great wisdom. The impassibility, the dignified attitude of the artists who perform it, lost in their task, without any idea of show, without any consideration for the audience, as if they were accomplishing a rite, adds tremendously to the impression. One forgets the time, the milieu, and oneself. One becomes involved in the ever-changing rhythms and tunes, so simple and so subtle, as they penetrate in the recesses of your soul." End of quotation. So let's end by going back almost to the beginning. I believe that we're all familiar with Bloch's statue of the Renaissance Christ that the composer purchased in Bern, Switzerland in 1906 at the behest of Robert Godet. But how many of us are aware of Bloch's statue of the Buddha? Hope you can see that clearly. I'm greatly indebted to Eric Johnson, who also is with us here this afternoon, evening, morning. Great pleasure to have him with us also, for having sent me a picture of this wonderful sculpture, which may have been photographed sometime between 1898 and 1905, when Bloch was in his late teens or early 20s. The floral background suggests either the young student's lodgings or the home of one of his instructors. Bloch wrote as follows to Lucien Audebert in 1925, apropos. He says, "For 15 years in my studio there has been an immense Christ from the 16th century. I also have a Buddha who meditates in his own language on the same problems, and a Confucius, a Lao Tzu, who dominates Jeremy of Michelangelo. And all understand each other because they come from the same unique family. Here is my Judaism. It is all too natural that the Jews don't understand it at all." End quote. In a letter this time to Romain Rolland, the following year, 1925, Bloch clarifies his position further. "My children did not receive any religious education, and our life is not Jewish. She," referring to his elder daughter Suzanne, "has simply lived in the atmosphere of my books, my Christ, my Buddha, a Confucius and Jeremy that I have around me. one religion, and my only religion. End of quote. I've noticed that many Jews feel an affinity for Buddhism, but to conflate Judaism with Buddhism might indeed be confusing to an observant Jew, primarily because of the clear prohibitions listed in the second of the Ten Commandments. But that is another topic for another occasion. So I thank you for your kind attention. I'd be very happy to hear whatever comments you may have some discussion, and if there's time we can play a little bit more music. So once again, thank you very much indeed. And I do apologize for all the problems with the technology earlier on.
That's absolutely fine, Alex. It went very well. So Malcolm Singer, you wanted to say unmute and say a few words?
Hello, yes, thank you. Well, Alex, that was absolutely fantastic. I'm almost dumbstruck. I'm sure a lot of people on the lecture know quite a lot about Bloch, but to learn about these Chinese interests is fascinating. For me particularly, because I'm teaching a PhD student at the moment who is Chinese, who's trying to articulate what is Chinese about his own Chinese music. And here we are in 2024 with Chinese musicians who were trained within the Western way of writing music, still trying to understand what is Chinese music. And to see Bloch doing it over 100 years ago in a kind of intuitive way is just absolutely fascinating. And certainly I could hear the Chinese influence in his music. And as someone who I lived in San Francisco and used to go to the Chinese opera in San Francisco, and it is completely artistically intoxicating. So it's quite easy to understand his overflowing prose about the influence of Chinese music on him. As you said, it's a work in progress. There's obviously masses more work that could be done, and maybe it will be Chinese scholars as well as us European and American scholars who will take it further and see how in depth he went into the what was known about Chinese music at the time. Anyway, absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I feel enlightened. I'm sure everyone does, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions from people on the Zoom lecture. So I'll pass it back to Geraldine for the moment. I'm not going to ask any questions yet, and let others come in and quiz you, because I'm sure you know a lot more than you told us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. And, very interesting to have those parallels that you've mentioned. So do raise your hand or just unmute and climb in, or whatever you want to do, or just make a comment or say something. Otherwise, I'll come to you and ask you to say something. So, better if you volunteer. Walter, go on. You're smiling. Unmute and you can tell us what you know about Chinese music. You have to unmute first. So don't run away, other people, if you think I'm going to pounce on you. I may not.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Walter.
Yes, Alex, I enjoyed your presentation enormously. It was totally fascinating. I find the subject itself very interesting, and but I don't have any questions in particular. I just absorbed what you had to say.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent.
I'm happy to come back in and ask a question if.
Go on, please.
So, Alex, there's a big tradition in the early 20th century of composers exploring the folk music of their own culture and other cultures. And how much would Bloch have been aware of? I suppose Bartók and Kodály are slightly later or simultaneous, and the revolution in English folk music, and so this whole exploration of folk musics. He's kind of contemporary with what other composers were doing. How aware? Do you know how aware he was of all of that kind of research?
I feel that he was definitely aware of it, but to what extent he kind of participated in it as one of a member of a whole group of composers doing this kind of thing, that seems more doubtful. He seemed to have been working very much, in his own world. If I think about the education that he had in places like Geneva and in Frankfurt and in other places, Paris, and as a student, he was really mainly exposed, it seems, to Western classical music of the time, the music of César Franck, the music of Debussy and Strauss, I mean Richard Strauss and Mussorgsky. This was his musical world, really. And of course, the great classics, Bach, Beethoven, etc. What happened was that at a later time, when he started preparing lectures for the Conservatoire, where he in Lausanne and Neuchâtel and places where he actually gave lectures on aesthetics, musical aesthetics, he then delved into all sorts of different ethnicities of music, the ones I've mentioned. I mean, I think I mentioned quite a few of those that he showed interest in, but those were by no means the only ones. He was very interested quite extensively in the music of the Middle East, for example, Jewish and of course Arabic, Turkish, etc., and then Indian and further east, as we see now, as well. And he incorporated the musical materials that he could find. These were the very early days of ethnomusicology. In fact, the word didn't exist until 1950. Before that, it was called comparative musicology, and the two big centers were the USA and Germany. And I mean, I'm sure you're aware of that, but I just emphasize it because he would have discovered all these kinds of musics, in his own right. It didn't seem to me that he was part of a movement or anything to do so. And so, therefore, in his lectures, he fascinated his students by talking about musics from different parts of the world, notations, and also recordings that were now gradually becoming available because this was becoming very fashionable. People found it, all sorts of words that we use now that are sort of somewhat discredited, like Oriental and other words that describe music outside Western classical music or Western folk music. These were ideas that were grasping very, very effectively his imagination. His development when it came to Jewish music itself didn't come until in effect until the 1910s, from 1910 till about 1918. But before that, he was really very, very interested in music of other cultures as well. When he was a child, he was fascinated by South America. He's on record as having spoken a great deal about the effect of certain legends and sagas and various other writings and histories of places like Peru and other big cultural centers of the past. And he was totally inflamed in his imagination by what he read about these different cultures. So I'm only mentioning these various things to show that he was already exposed to a lot, but it wasn't as part of a movement. In other words, he was not doing it because there was a school of such kind of composition. And I don't think, I mean, I know that he had some contact with Bartók, But that, I think, came at a later time. Bartok, for example, was a very keen exponent of Bloch's music and played he played Bloch's music in concert, for example. But I don't think it was Bartok's ethnomusicology that was part of Bloch's main experience. So I'm sorry I'm not giving you a very precise answer, but it seems to me that Bloch really was very much doing his own thing and being really quite original in his approach to incorporating elements outside of the Western world into his Western classical music.
Very comprehensive. Thank you.
Okay.
Sita wants to talk. Yes, please.
I wanted to mention that when my mother met my father, who was Bulgarian, Bloch was fascinated by the music. My grandfather had all kinds of interests in different music, but he was really fascinated by the Bulgarian music, which also incorporated Greek and Turkish and Macedonian and in that era. And we had a lot of records.
And I'll add to that. My grandmother wrote in her diaries that he would told the children, you know, if you're out and about and you see a record from you don't know where, or you might know where and you're unfamiliar, bring it home, because he was just a sponge to listen to anything that he had not heard before. And I think also that goes with being a voracious reader. I mean, he read,
Yes.
you know, so much. So starting as a child, and when you read about stories from all these other countries and you're a musician, why wouldn't you want to hear also what are they playing, what are they creating,
And where is their influence coming from?
Yes, thank you. It's true. Yeah.
And I just wondered whether Bloch could have been the inspiration to Yehudi Menuhin, who met him when he was an impressionable teenager. And Yehudi took on this mantle of being interested in musics of the world.
Absolutely. Whether that was concurrent or whether he was influenced by Bloch, but they certainly had a very similar worldview. And Yehudi, throughout his life, was interested in all Indian music, but all, as Alex would say, ethnomusicology before the term was used as a term.
Well, I'm seeing Bloch as perhaps an inspiration for that.
Could well have been. Could well have been.
Malcolm Miller.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it was really interesting. Alex, so I have just a quick offer, which is that I just recall seeing some correspondence by Suzanne. I think it was when I was doing research, and there's a letter where she goes into a lot about her father's Chinese interest in Chinese music and everything, and I'd just like to just sort of find that source. Would be quite nice. My question is a little bit to go back to the thing about connecting with what was going on at the time. I think slightly earlier was it Puccini. There's a sort of story about Puccini and Madame Butterfly that he actually had. There was some source that he was actually able to access when he was writing that, you know, sort of Japanese influences, and it was because of the recordings. And I think what I'm struck actually is by the fact that you started with the 78, the idea of the 78s, and it's sort of so much to do with that period of the early recordings. So I'm trying to get to a question, like, so to what extent the interest, let's say, that had developed in chinoiserie, or that, you know, amongst the certain composers before that, was sort of encouraged in its own way, this sort of interest in recording these things, and that somehow was a particularly strong influence on Bloch, you know, and to what extent the medium affected him. It wasn't so much that that he was actively looking for sources, but that this proliferation of the recording industry somehow impinged on him. and therefore he could access this. Perhaps, well, are there other types of music that he accessed in the same way, like American native music, or sort of some of the other world musics?
Yeah,
So,
well, I think if we just think for a moment back to that time when all these different kinds of music suddenly became available, music that had probably been fairly esoteric and fairly, only the province of the very early anthropologists who would go traveling to distant parts of the world. Imagine what an incredible impact it must have had on audiences who would go to a concert and then would hear music that was influenced by these different styles, and also were buying discs, 78 RPM discs, which were suddenly becoming available. It must have been mind-blowing. It's just like nowadays when we think of, of the internet and how extraordinarily wide-ranging our new experience of the world is from different parts of the world. There's nowhere in a way that is remote anymore. And so it must have been something analogous, not the same, of course, but analogous at that time. And I know that there were all these world exhibitions took place, and like there have been more recently, but this was really an extraordinary time. I know 1851 was the World Exhibition in London, and that was a little bit earlier than the period that we're talking about now. But people coming from so many different parts of the world, playing and singing their own music, and people listening to it and being completely overwhelmed by what they were hearing because they'd never heard it before. So I have a feeling this was happening to Bloch as well. I mean, he would have been very, very fascinated by everything that was happening, including Jewish music. I mean, he was exposed to the Society for Jewish Folk Song, St. Petersburg, 1908, when the society was giving concerts in different parts of Europe away from St. Petersburg. And he was totally fascinated by the music of, Jewish communities in rural Russia, for example. And he loved to go to those kind of concerts, as well as all the other kinds that we're talking about, and we're talking primarily about China today. So I think it was in the air. I think you're absolutely right, Malcolm, both Malcolms actually. It was very much in the air that there should be this sense, this feeling of exploration, this feeling of adventure, really, of hearing new sounds. It must be rather like, what we do when we listen to maybe electronic music, or there are all sorts of parallels I can think of. Must have been a really extraordinarily alive time to be a musician.
Do we know, Alex, apart from that Buddha, did he have Chinese calligraphy and artwork in his collection? Do we know that?
I don't know, and I think I would like to hand over to Lucienne and Sita about that one, because as far as I know, not, but there may well have been. So perhaps, would you have a view on that?
Yeah, he definitely did. One of his most treasured pieces was a scroll. I don't remember if it was a Chinese scroll or a Japanese scroll, but it was Japanese. But it was one of his top things when the children got to choose one main thing of theirs after their father died. The scroll was what actually my grandmother had chosen, and then donated it to something somewhere.
Portland.
Oh, okay.
And it was very big. It was probably maybe 3 feet by 8 feet. It was very large, and it hung in his study. It was quite fascinating to look at.
And then there's the photograph, self-portrait he took of himself wearing a Japanese robe. I think it was when he was in San Francisco as well that time. So I mean, those are just two things that pop out of right away. But yes, he definitely had, and I mean, he had trinkets and things from all over that he had picked up, not in those countries. But one question I did have, Alex, was, do you know how he was invited over to go to, was it Bali via China and Japan that you mentioned?
Yes, there was some kind of plan for him to go traveling. This was in the late 1920s. but I think that it's all documented in the Levinsky-Dijon volumes. I have to say that it's not fresh in my mind. I don't know exactly what happened, but I do know that, well, as we know, Bloch had a very volatile personal life, and I think that it was the influence of circumstances that caused him not to go in the end traveling. And it would be wrong for me to say that I know exactly the reason why not, but it was to do with personal issues that he felt that he had to go to Europe.
I was more interested in how he was invited.
I don't know whether it was actually an invitation. It may have been that he felt motivated by this time because, you know, he had composed the America Symphony. He composed in 1926, and I think that really at that time he was moving very much towards composing the sacred service, and he wanted somewhere quiet to go. Now, maybe he felt that going to the Polynesia or the Pacific Islands or somewhere would have been a very good place to find quiet and solace during which to compose the sacred service, which was the next thing that came on the map, which was in 1930. So I don't think, but again, I have to confess that I don't know. I think that it may not have been that he had been invited and declined the invitation. It was that he actually wanted to, on his own initiative, perhaps in company, to go to places far away from anything that was familiar to him. But then, in the end, it didn't work out, and he went to Europe, to Italy and France instead, and Switzerland. So, I see that Judy has mentioned, what about Turandot? Or Turandot? Yes, indeed. Well, but that was all part of the whole ferment, the whole atmosphere, you know, evoking East Asia.
Yeah. Sorry, can I just, yes, because it wasn't just in the musical world, it was the art world as well.
Of course.
If you think about the influence of the Japanese prints and all the art that came over, and when you mentioned those great exhibitions, I think they also were a big influence on the art world and presumably the music world as well. I'm not a musicologist, as you well know, but I had a feeling that Debussy was also influenced by the music of the
gamelan, the Javanese and Balinese gamelan. Yeah, absolutely. It was very
Yes.
Malcolm?
Yeah, well, with Debussy, it was a result of the Great Exhibition in Paris, and then Debussy became he collected a lot of Japanese prints, and Paul Roberts has written a wonderful book called Image, which is all about the Japanese influence on Debussy. It's a very readable book. You don't have to be a musicologist for it. So I would recommend Image by Paul Roberts, who teaches at Guildhall. But it's a wonderful book. But that was all the Japanese exhibition. And of course, Gilbert and Sullivan then came up with the Mikado, which was which was their take on the Oriental culture.
And there was also Monet. I believe he also had, I think it was Japanese rather than Chinese, but prints that influenced him hugely.
And I think that Paul Gauguin actually did what Bloch would like to have done. He did actually go to, I was at Tahiti, I believe, and lived there and settled there in a way. So, and I think that whether Bloch knew about that or whether Bloch was influenced by that idea or not, that I'm not sure. But certainly it was very much a sort of a very evocative thing to do, and there were many people who really felt that that was where their life was taking them.
Can I
Malcolm Miller?
Yeah, can I just sort of bring it slightly into the sort of polemical aspect of the argument, which is this sort of issue of Orientalism. And so I picked up the sort of the main point. What you're trying to say is that on the one hand, you have this interest in the authentic sources, but not only that, that the audiences that actually listen to that authentic sources relate it to the Chinese, the East it's sort of coming, it's still the West appropriating the East, but it's also a question of the East approaching the West, and there's a sort of a meeting point, so that a composer working at a certain time in China might have come up with the same type of treatment. That's what you mentioned. This, I'm just going by what you mentioned of the response of the audience, that there was a sort of a somehow that Bloch was almost writing as if he was a Chinese composer at that time. He could have come up with the same sort of thing. Now that would mean that it wasn't a question of the West appropriating the East, because it's something else. So that's point one. The second point would be to say that Bloch's own style, if I can sort of be a bit broad on that sort of general, it's a bit vague comment, Willie, but his use of elements like sort of fifths and pedal points and certain types of harmony and certain types of pentatonicism in not only these works, but of course other works, well, the American works and the Jewish works, but that there's something which he almost felt tapped into, that the folk music that he was hearing, so that it wasn't a question of something alien, that it could have been there was some identity that he was looking for. So again, that would cut across the traditional view of the Western appropriation of the East, because it's doing something a bit more. And the third point would be, well, he was just a Western musician appropriating the East. So which of those, what I'm sort of asking a little bit about, how do you see that argument going, and where do we sort of get to it at the end of it?
Okay, well, I mean, I'd be very happy, for this to be a general discussion. So I would look forward to hearing what other people have to say. But I don't think that Bloch was being a Western imperialist. I really, really, really don't think so. I think he had enormous respect for the music that he was listening to, and I think that he somehow wanted to integrate it into his own musical identity, if you like, because he admired it. He didn't want to use it for what it could give him. He wanted to use it for what he could give to it. That's how it feels to me. And I think that all the elements that you've mentioned about parallel fifths and fourths and, pentatonic scale and all that sort of thing, it was very much a Chinese version of the pentatonic scale. This was not a Scottish version of the pentatonic scale, or a Jewish cantillation, a sort of laning, where there is some elements of pentatonic as well. This was really a very Chinese and Far Eastern, and indeed it wasn't really very Japanese either. There's certain Japanese modes that don't appear so clearly in Bloch's music, whereas the Chinese ones do. And I think that he had an enormous resonance with it. I mean, he really felt a sort of affinity for that kind of music. So I don't know whether he... I feel that there was something very genuine about his wish to use this material to express something that could only be expressed in that way, as a reflection also of his philosophy, because his philosophy of life was very much connected with Eastern philosophy. He was in some ways much closer to that than to Jewish philosophy. And so therefore it seems that it's quite natural that that could have been reflected in music as well.
Thanks. Yeah.
Steve Schwartz, you wanted to talk. Can you unmute?
Thank you. I just wanted to add that to what Alexander Knapp said, and that is that it seemed to me that Bloch Bloch's Orientalism was a lot like Emerson's Orientalism, especially the poem that begins, "I am the slayer and the slain." I mean, it's an integration or a quest for a personal philosophy rather than an appropriation. That's it.
Thanks. And Steve also wrote in the, do you want to say what you wrote in the chat?
Oh, apparently everybody took every one of the points that I was writing about in the chat. So there's no reason to.
Okay, so
There's no reason.
Turkish pastiches enjoyed a booklet in the 18th and 19th
Oh, a boomlet.
century.
A boomlet. That's autocorrect.
And about the Mikado, etc. Debussy and Ravel. So thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
So there's Frank. That's very interesting. I was going to raise a point with Frank about the Christ, the Renaissance Christ, because I think it may be that the Renaissance Christ is something that stayed with Bloch throughout his life, from 1906 right to the time that he died. And that was a long, long time. I mean, what was that? That was 53 years. But it seems that Bloch also had other, perhaps less, how shall I say, less vivid examples of statues and other, sort of items of art that were also really quite important to him, which actually, since it seems that he had also this Buddha, also a Confucius, also other Chinese and also Western artifacts. But it is definitely the Christ that is the one that is most often mentioned, and it's the one that is most or best known by people who have shown an interest in Ernest Bloch. And I think that's an interesting topic because since there were all these other items, I'm just wondering how it is that they may have got a little bit sidelined, possibly because they came into his life a little later, or they left his life a little earlier. It's hard to tell, but it's just that, the Christ seems to be the really prominent statue that is associated somehow with Bloch. Pardon?
When there's drama behind something, like there was with the statue, and there's a story behind the drama, I think that's what really put that in the light.
Yes, I think that's true.
Not a big drama or story behind his Confucius, except for that, that was what Suzanne had chosen when her father died. That's what she wanted. So there's a lot of, he had definitely a lot of different cultures surrounding him in his home with pieces of art besides the Christ.
Yeah, sure.
Frank, did you want to say something?
Although the Christ was huge, it even looked more than life size to me, and it hung in his living room. Every time you walked in that room, you couldn't help but see it. It was
Yeah, it was so big that maybe that's why it's more prominent, because of its size.
Oh, sure. That would have been part of it, sure. Yeah.
A lot of the self-portraits as well, it's there behind him. So
I guess my one comment would be to Eric. You did some videos featuring Bloch's music and photos. Is there any amount of photography that reflects this Oriental or Asian topic?
I don't think the photographs probably show anything that I could deduce. What you will find are pictures from Chinatown, a few in San Francisco, stereos he took. So he took his camera with him. I don't know of any interiors, just exteriors of streets. I think I shared a couple with Alex, but can't give you much more than that. I mean, he was absolutely fascinated with it. And of course, everything he was fascinated with, he took pictures of. Mountains, people, family, girlfriends, everything.
Perhaps if he'd gone to Tahiti, we would have had more pictures.
Yep.
So I think this has been a wonderful session, really, really refreshing and stimulating. Thank everybody who's contributed. Thank Alex so much. Our next session is called Top Brass, Bloch's work for trumpet and trombone. He composed a symphony for trombone and orchestra and proclamation for trumpet and orchestra in his Agate Beach years. This conversation with Aaron Klaus, trumpet, and Nathaniel Lees, trombonist and educator, will bring light to these underperformed pieces. Now, we've got this down for the 13th of January, but I'm just not going to be here in January, so I might have to change the date. So I'll certainly put on the list whatever the date is going to be, because seeing it's my Zoom, it might be worthwhile just moving it either forward or backwards. So we'll be in touch. Thank you all for listening. Thank you, Alex, again. And thank you. And shall we just say happy birthday to Lucien Allen, Bloch's great granddaughter, who's celebrating her birthday with Bloch tonight. So thanks for being with us, Lucien, and your mom, Sita. It's just lovely to have you, and all the best to everybody. See you again soon. Bye.